Self-awareness has become such a buzzword that some of you could wonder why it's even important and why it even matters to have self-awareness. It essentially allows you to avoid sabotaging and making mistakes in regards to situations that you actually want to keep in your life, okay? If you are self-aware in the moment, it can help you avoid, say, pushing away a friendship that you actually value, because you're like projecting some old wounds onto somebody that doesn't deserve it, right? But if you're not aware of the reason behind why you get triggered by certain things, then you're going to keep making the same mistake. So say that there's this couple named Robert and Tina, okay? I'm just making up names, right? But they both love each other and want to be together, right? Okay. That's their intention, right? But it's like, say Robert came from a household where his every decision was questioned and he was always criticized for every behavior that he exhibited or whatever in that household. So whenever Tina is saying stuff such as, oh, it's supposed to be your job to take the trash out or whatever, or, you know, you were kind of rude to me earlier, I would appreciate if you didn't yell at me or whatever. Then say Robert becomes overly defensive and is starting to attack Tina and thinks that she's toxic and a terrible person to be in a relationship with or whatever, and starts to lash out on her. But he feels entitled and valid in doing that because he feels like, oh, everybody is always criticizing me, I have to stand up for myself. But it's just coming from a wound from his childhood, right? But he's not aware of that, so instead he projects that sort of oh, everybody just misunderstands me energy onto everybody, okay? And then say that, I don't know, Tina ends up leaving him, right? And then so he tells everybody that she didn't understand him and he doesn't understand why he left her, blah, blah, blah. But it's because he lacked self awareness and was not able to take accountability for the mistakes that he was making in their relationship, because, again, it was always everybody else's problem, not him. And so it's giving to where people hold on to the time period where they were actually a legit victim, but then they carry that mindset into their adult life and stuff like that, to where even if they are the aggressor, they still perceive themselves as a victim again, and it comes from a lack of self-awareness. And then when Robert ends up alone, then he's confused and it just makes him angrier and stuff like that. But it could have been avoided if he was aware that it wasn't actually Tina that was the problem. It was stuff from his childhood, okay? And going beyond that point, it's I get that some of you seeing this could be a minor or whatever. So if you're still underneath the thumb of a toxic household, it's a bit more complicated, and I get that. From experience, basically when you're in a toxic household that you can't escape, the best thing you can do is work on your mindset. And sometimes it feels like you have to lean into positive forms of escapism, right? And focusing on the ways in your plans, like that you want to have in place. You have to fortify your self-worth in some way, regardless of how people are treating you outside of yourself, so that when you are actually sort of released to the wild or whatever, and when you enter your adulthood, you aren't sort of floundering, and you aren't say if you're in a super controlling environment, you don't ricochet and start overindulging in substances and stuff like that, and partying every weekend because you're like, oh, well, this is how I exhibit my freedom. And then you start to sabotage your potential for actually building a better life for yourself. And then sometimes you know you get into that situation where you're sabotaging everything, and then you have no choice but to end up back in that toxic household because you have no other options, right? So I get that sometimes the only thing you can do is work on your mindset and your self concept and building up your self-worth. But if you're an adult, and you kind of have to acknowledge and validate the experiences that you had in your past, like in your childhood and growing up and stuff like that. But ultimately, you are in full control of your life once you're an adult. You know what I mean? And I get that it's a psychological thing, and some people are in abusive relationships to where they can't escape them. But it kind of needs to get to the point where you kind of you gain enough self-awareness to avoid getting in those toxic relationships in the first place, so you don't even get yourself in a situation where that's like taking place. And like I get that sometimes that's, you know, obviously that's easier to say in retrospect because people can be sort of deceptive, but also that's why another buzzword that you might keep hearing is important, which is discernment, right? And also not rushing into things so that you actually take the time to get to know somebody. You have to like if you want to make a decision to invest in somebody and be in a long-term like commitment with them, including like going on to live with that person, you need to make sure that you literally like see all sides of them, and I mean like the worst of them as well as the best of them, because obviously it's easy to just show somebody the good side of you, but you need to see somebody crash out because everybody crashes out in some way, and you need to see like how do they act when things are like terrible, you know what I mean? And you have to see, are they blaming everybody else for it? Are they like able to express their emotions in a healthy way, et cetera, you know? You have to keep an eye out for somebody who, the type of person who stubs their toe and then they like hit the wall. That's always like a red flag, obviously, because, the wall didn't make them run into it. But those type of people, they carry that mindset into a lot of different things. But like, I feel like people have trouble being self aware because they kind of feel like if their intentions are good, then that's good enough. But it really isn't because, there are people who could be like activists in some sense, or they're always like the people who are all on board about like being hyper vigilant about canceling people for saying one wrong thing or whatever. But I like, I forget, like, it's something I read, but the people who are in that sort of energy, like, I don't know. Like activism can quickly turn into like being a tyrant, like it's a slippery slope. It's like one of those like thin lines between love and hate. Like there's a thin line between being like an activist for something and being a tyrant. So you have to kind of be aware of when you getting to the point where you're like forcing your views on other people, or you're like being too harsh of a judge on others just because of your own principles. And like you have to really ask yourself, like, you know, is it worth popping a blood vessel over something? Like, you need to focus on the things that you can actually control. And for the most part, for all of us, you have to focus on being able to control yourself first. Like, if you're trying to influence the way that people think and the way that they operate and their behavior and their opinions, but you can't even like control your ability to, not react when someone's trying to rage bait you, you have to sort of go within first. You know what I mean? And also another part of like self-awareness is like, oh, if you keep saying that you want to like move forward and progress your life in some way, and you know what I mean, like you're done with everybody or whatever in the past, you're just ready to move on, you're ready for a change, but you keep gossiping about the same people, you keep like stalking the same people's accounts or whatever, you keep like wishing people bad. I think that, an exercise in self-awareness that can kind of like gauge where you are in regards to your ability to be truly honest with yourself is like, are you censoring yourself when you're journaling? Like, are you like, do you say, oh, I can't write that, that's too mean, or oh, I can't write that, that's too whatever, 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 or what if someone sees this, or blah blah blah. You need to find some space, even if it's literally just like, I don't know, going to a park and being in your car and like pretending you're on the phone with somebody and just like venting and saying whatever, regardless of whatever it is. It doesn't matter. Like anything. Just say whatever is on your mind. And then, don't censor yourself, but like just get it all out. And then you can just be aware of, okay, if you say some things that are like troubling to you, you can sort of like assess, okay, why do I even think this way? Like, why do I have this mindset? If you're bothered by some of the things that come out, you can be like, well, where does that even come from? But if it's hard for you to even be sort of like honest with yourself, you know, you have to assess the state of your subconscious mind. Otherwise, you're like never being authentic, and you're never going to be able to know what you actually want out of life. And you're never going to be able to like progress forward in a direction that actually makes you happy, because a lot of people are unhappy with your life, but you can get to the point where you're not. like laying up at night with like thoughts reeling around in your head, it kind of does start with like self-awareness. So